The penniless companion Eleanor Gray arrived at Ashworth Park on the 14th of November, packed into the back of the Vanes' hired carriage alongside 3 hat boxes and a damp wool travelling rug, and she did not yet know that the cold and fearsome Duke of Ashworth had already noticed her. Once, briefly, through a frosted window, and had thought her the most sensible-looking woman to have approached his house in a very long time. The drive from London had taken 9 hours. The roads north of Huntingdon were frozen ruts beneath a pewter sky, and Lady Vane had spent the final 3 of those hours reading aloud from a letter of social intelligence she had composed herself, cataloguing the Duke's known assets. Ashworth Park in Cambridgeshire, Harlow House in Grosvenor Square, an estate in Northumberland, whose name she could not quite pronounce, but which returned, she had been reliably informed, somewhere above £4,000 per annum. Her daughter Cassandra sat across from Eleanor in a travelling coat of French blue wool, her dark hair dressed with rather more care than the occasion strictly required, and she said very little, because Cassandra Vane had found very early in life that people talked more pleasantly at one when one said very little, and she had cultivated that silence into something very like an art. Eleanor said nothing at all, which was different from Cassandra's silence in every conceivable way. Eleanor was not performing reticence, she was simply invisible, which was her habitual condition in the Vane household, and which she had, over 2 years of living on the charity of her mother's cousin, learned to accept with something approaching equanimity. She wore grey wool. She always wore grey wool, it being the colour Lady Vane considered appropriate for a companion. And her boots were good, but 3 winters old, and the only things about her that were not grey were her eyes, which were a clear and rather watchful brown, and her hands, which showed, had anyone thought to look, the practical evidence of a life spent doing things. A small burn scar on her left thumb from a stillroom accident at 17, knuckles that had known cold water and harder work than the Vanes imagined. She was 22 years old, orphaned at 15 when her father, the Reverend Thomas Gray of Wymondham, died of a winter ague that had swept through his parish like a scythe, leaving behind a rectory that was not his to keep, a library that was sold to settle debts, and one daughter who had nobody. A distant connection of her mother's had been traced eventually, and that connection had proved to be Lady Vane, who was not unkind by nature but who was relentlessly practical, and who had concluded that an orphaned cousin with no portion and no prospects could be useful, and had therefore taken Eleanor in on terms that were never spoken aloud, but were understood by both parties. In exchange for bed and board and a small dress allowance, Eleanor would serve as Cassandra's companion, would handle correspondence and stillroom accounts, and the management of minor household crises, and would make herself agreeable and unobtrusive in all company. Eleanor had kept her side of that bargain faithfully for 2 years. She was very good at unobtrusive. She had learned it slowly, and then all at once, the way one learns most of the hard things. In her father's house she had never been unseen. She had been the rector's daughter, known to every soul in the parish, greeted at the lich gate and consulted about the sick, and remembered at Christmas with small offerings of eggs and honey, and once, memorably, a live goose that had bitten her. To go from that, from being a person who was woven into the fabric of a place, to being a piece of useful furniture in someone else's drawing room, had been a lesson in a particular kind of grief, and she had come out the other side of it, with the discovery that invisibility, once accepted, had its own small freedoms. No one asked an invisible woman to perform. No one required her to be charming, or beautiful, or agreeable beyond the minimum. She could sit in her corner and watch the world with her clear brown eyes and think whatever she liked, and no one troubled to wonder what a companion in grey wool was thinking, which was, she had concluded, their loss and not entirely hers. The iron gates of Ashworth Park appeared through the carriage window at 3:30, when the last of the November light was going grey behind the elms. Eleanor looked out and felt, despite herself, a small catch of something that was not quite admiration, but was near it. The house was old, Queen Anne, she thought, with later additions, and it sat at the end of a gravel drive, flanked by horse chestnuts, whose stripped November branches made a cathedral of the approach, the canopy of crossed limbs meeting overhead in the fading light. The windows were lit, which meant fires had been banked against the cold, and the warm amber squares of glass against the grey stone gave the whole place the quality of an engraving, precise, settled, slightly formidable. Rooks were coming home to the elms in a slow, untidy stream, calling to one another in the cold air, and somewhere beyond the house a dog was barking, twice, and then stopping, as though it had thought better of the effort. Ashworth, she had gathered from 2 years of the Vanes' dinner-table conversation, was 33 and had been duke since he was 21, when his father died suddenly of apoplexy at Newmarket, leaving behind a title, a complicated web of entailed and unentailed properties, and a reputation for being difficult that had attached itself to the son, partly by inheritance and partly by the son's own refusal to make things easier for anyone. He was not rude, precisely, but he was also not warm. He said what he thought. He did not say more than he thought. He had spent the last 3 seasons producing no heir and no particular inclination toward producing one, and his mother, the Dowager Duchess, had reportedly been writing him increasingly pointed letters from Bath, where she wintered on account of her nerves. Lady Vane had contrived this country visit through a mutual connection who happened to be Ashworth's mother's friend's sister, and the invitation, such as it was, had been extended with what the social intelligence reports called encouraging warmth, by which Lady Vane meant that the man had not actively refused. The carriage halted at the front steps. A butler appeared at the door, grey-haired, correct, with the particular dignity of old family servants who have outlasted several generations of their employers. And behind him, 2 footmen with lanterns, and behind them, the warm light of a hall that smelled of wood smoke and beeswax and something faintly medicinal that Eleanor noticed and filed away and did not mention. The hall itself was stone-flagged and high, hung with a pair of dim old portraits and a set of antlers, and a great long-case clock stood against the far wall, ticking the slow seconds of the house away, and the cold of the outdoors gave way, as she stepped inside, to the particular banked warmth of a well-run establishment in winter. Fires that had been lit hours ago and tended since, the heat gone deep into the walls. His Grace the Duke of Ashworth met them in the drawing-room at 4 o'clock. He was taller than Eleanor had expected, and thinner, which she also had not quite expected, though in retrospect the thinness seemed consistent with the face. A long, angular face, very controlled, the sort of face that had learned early to reveal nothing, and had practiced that lesson to exhaustion. He had dark eyes and dark hair going a little grey at the temple, and he stood near the fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back, which was a posture that made men look either military or cold, and on Julian, Duke of Ashworth, it looked both. He greeted Lady Vane with correct courtesy, and Cassandra with what Lady Vane would later describe to her maid, with some satisfaction, as noticeable attention, though Eleanor, who had been watching, thought his attention had been perfectly even, which was not the same thing as noticeable in any meaningful way. He did not greet Eleanor, which was not a slight so much as an accurate assessment of the social mathematics. Companions did not require greeting. They were present, as furniture is present, and were made comfortable, and that was sufficient. Eleanor found her own way to a chair near the far window, and accepted tea when a footman offered it, and spent the remainder of the afternoon hour observing the room. What she observed was this: the Duke was not well. It was subtle. He would not have thanked her for noticing, but the signs were there for anyone who had spent a country childhood in a rectory where the sick were regularly brought and tended and watched. He was warm, not room warm, personally warm, in the way of a fever that is not yet serious but is quietly considering becoming so. He stood because sitting seemed to cost him something. He drank his tea quickly, as men do who are cold from the inside, and she saw him once press 2 fingers against his own temple in a gesture so brief and controlled that no one else caught it. There was a faint sheen at his hairline that was not the warmth of the fire, and when he turned to answer a question from Lady Vane, he turned a fraction too slowly, the way a man moves when his head has begun to ache, and he is managing the ache by refusing to acknowledge it. He was also, she thought, attempting to ignore it. This, too, was familiar. Men of a certain temperament, her father had been one of them, considered illness an imposition, a bureaucratic inconvenience, and treated their own bodies with a kind of impatient imperiousness that invariably made things worse. Her father had preached on a Sunday with a chill on his chest that he would not name, and had visited 3 sickbeds that afternoon in the rain, and had been dead within the fortnight. And Eleanor had never quite forgiven the particular male vanity that dressed itself up as strength, and called the naming of an illness a weakness. She looked at the Duke of Ashworth standing too straight by his own fireplace, and she recognized the pattern, and she said nothing because it was not her place, and she was very good at knowing her place. Dinner that evening was 12 at table. The Duke, his guests, a neighbouring baronet and his wife, a clergyman the Duke apparently liked, 2 young men from a nearby estate, whose names Eleanor did not catch, and a cousin of Ashworth's called Mr. Theodore Ashworth, who was amiable and loud, and had the cheerful energy of a man who has never had to worry very much about anything. Mrs. Drayton, the housekeeper, a compact, shrewd woman of 50, with the keys of the house at her belt, and 30 years' knowledge of Ashworth's walls in her head, oversaw the serving with an efficiency that Eleanor recognized and respected. The dining room was panelled in dark old oak, and the candles down the length of the table were beeswax, not tallow, this being the Duke's table and not the servants' hall. The light of them moved gently over the silver and the faces, and the long windows behind their heavy curtains rattled once or twice in the rising wind, for the weather was turning, and by the sound of it, the night would bring a hard frost. Eleanor was seated at the far end of the table, between the clergyman, who was kind, and talked to her at some length about the history of the local parish records, and an empty chair that had been set for a guest who had sent last-minute apologies. She ate the dinner, which was very good: a game soup, a pair of roasted pheasants, a ragout of vegetables, a syllabub she did not quite manage to finish, and listened to the conversation and said nothing that had not been directly addressed to her, and was very nearly entirely content. The cruelty, when it came, was not the explosive kind. It was the small, surgical kind, which is in some ways worse. The table's conversation had turned to books, specifically to the question of whether novel reading was a useful occupation for young women, which was a conversation that tended to go in circles and that Eleanor found privately tedious, having read extensively in her father's library from the age of 9 and formed settled views on the matter. Lady Vane was expounding on the dangers of too much imagination in young females when the clergyman, Mr. Alderton, he had said his name was, turned to Eleanor and asked, with genuine curiosity, what she herself enjoyed reading. Eleanor had begun to answer. She had been partway through saying that she had found Miss Burney's novels instructive on the question of female character under social pressure, which was a thought she had been working out for some time, when Lady Vane cut across her from the other end of the table with a little laugh that was not unkind in its tone, but was very precisely aimed. "You must forgive Miss Grey's opinions, Mr. Alderton. She is a great reader, of course. It is her chief comfort, as companions have very little else to fill their hours. Though I often say that too much reading gives one ideas above one's station, and poor Eleanor has enough of those already." There was a beat of silence. Not long, only a second or two, but Eleanor had lived long enough in close quarters with society to know what that beat meant. It was the moment when a table full of people collectively decided whether to register what had been said or to move past it, as though it had not been said. The table moved past it. Cassandra, beside her mother, was looking at the tablecloth. She had very beautiful manners at dinner, Cassandra, and one of those manners was the ability to not quite see things that happened in her vicinity. The Duke, Eleanor noticed, was looking at his wine glass with an expression that was unreadable. He was always unreadable. But there was something in the set of his jaw that had shifted fractionally. Eleanor picked up her fork and resumed eating. She did not look at the clergyman, because she did not want to see his expression, whatever it was, and she did not look at Lady Vane, because she had found that looking at the person who had just diminished you gave them information they hadn't earned. She ate her ragout with composure and thought, not for the first time, about what it meant to be invisible, and whether it was possible to be so thoroughly invisible that you eventually stopped existing to yourself. The Duke coughed quietly and pressed his knuckles to his mouth, and the cough went on a fraction too long. The following morning he did not come down to breakfast. Mrs. Drayton appeared in the breakfast room at 8:30 with the information, delivered to Lady Vane, that His Grace was indisposed and that they should make themselves comfortable and not concern themselves. Lady Vane received this with a thin smile and said they would of course do exactly that, and spent the remainder of breakfast reorganizing Cassandra's plan of campaign for the day in terms of conspicuous accomplishment. She would play the pianoforte in the music room at 11, which the Duke's rooms apparently overlooked, and she would walk in the gallery at 2, which happened to pass near his private study. Eleanor ate her toast and said nothing. Outside the breakfast room windows, the promised frost had come. The lawns were white and stiff with it. The box hedges of the formal garden rhymed silver, and the sky above the elms was the flat, hard grey of a day that would not warm above freezing. It was, she thought, exactly the sort of weather that turned a chill into something worse. By noon it was apparent that the Duke was not merely indisposed. Mrs. Drayton, who had 30 years of practice at concealing household anxieties, was not quite concealing hers. Eleanor saw it in the way the woman's pace through the halls had shifted, a little faster, a little more purposeful, and in the whispered consultation between her and the butler, Mr. Crane, outside the library door, which Eleanor happened to pass at 11 o'clock on her way to retrieve a volume she had been promised sight of. She slowed her own pace, which was easy to do when one had a habit of moving quietly, and heard 3 words that settled the matter. The fevers worsened. A physician had been sent for from the market town of Purton, 4 miles distant, but the road was iced, and the messenger had returned to say that Dr. Granger was attending a difficult birth and could not come before evening. Eleanor went to find Mrs. Drayton. She found her in the stillroom, the house's stillroom, tucked off the kitchen passage, smelling of dried herbs and old vinegar, and the particular dense warmth of shelves that had been maintained for decades. Mrs. Drayton was moving with the concentrated efficiency of someone who is holding a great deal of anxiety very tightly, and she looked up when Eleanor appeared in the doorway with the particular expression of a woman who expected either an inconvenience or nothing of use. "Miss Grey," she said, not unkindly but without warmth. Eleanor said she hoped she was not intruding. She said she had some experience with fever cases and wondered whether she might be of any assistance, and that she understood perfectly if Mrs. Drayton preferred to manage matters herself, as she no doubt had managed them many times before. She said this in a tone that was useful and brisk and left no space for embarrassment, and she watched the housekeeper's expression move through suspicion and consideration and arrive at something that was close to provisional acceptance. "Dr. Granger will come by evening," Mrs. Drayton said. "Yes," Eleanor agreed, "and until he does, the fever wants cooling and the room wants airing. And if there is dried elderflower and willow bark in this room, I can make a tisane that my father used in his parish for 30 years. There was a pause. Mrs. Drayton looked at her for a long moment, with a quality of attention that was different from any attention Eleanor had received since arriving at Ashworth. "The elderflower is on the second shelf," she said. "The willow bark is in the small tin beside it." Eleanor washed her hands at the stone sink and went to work. She did not yet know that Mrs. Drayton, watching her move through the stillroom with the easy competence of someone who has done this many times, had formed an opinion that would prove rather consequential, nor that Mr. Crane, who appeared in the doorway at noon to provide Mrs. Drayton with some intelligence about the Duke's temperature, and was startled to find a guest in the stillroom making a medicinal tisane with considerable authority, had formed a very similar opinion. She knew only the work, the slow drawing of heat out of dried bark, the smell of the elderflower opening in the steam, the careful measurement of the decoction into a plain white cup. She had done this in cold country winters since she was 11 years old, first watching her father's housekeeper, then helping, then doing it alone while her father sat with the sick and read to them from his Bible. She knew the difference between a fever that was burning itself out and one that was digging in, and she knew the early signs of the second. She did not know which one the Duke had, but she intended to find out. Mrs. Drayton took her upstairs. The Duke's rooms were on the first floor, east wing, at the end of a corridor lined with landscape paintings. Views of the Ashworth estates, she gathered, in various weathers, and very good ones, precise and unsentimental in the way of Dutch work. The room itself was large and overly warm, the fire banked too high, the curtains half drawn against the grey November noon, the air close and faintly sour in the way of rooms where a man had been sweating through the night. He was in bed. She had expected that much. What she had not quite expected was the degree to which the cold and fearsome Duke of Ashworth, stripped of his vertical posture and his controlled expression and his ability to look at people from a height, looked simply unwell and fairly miserable and considerably younger than 33. He was awake, which was something, but his eyes were glassy and his face had the particular flush of a fever sitting between 99 and 102, and he was watching her enter the room with an expression that moved from surprise through something that was almost certainly wounded dignity, and then settled into a look that was resigned and too tired for the wound. "Mrs. Drayton," he said, and his voice was rougher than it had been the previous evening, "I told Crane I wanted no fuss. You also told Crane you wanted no physician, and Dr. Granger will be here by 6, Mrs. Drayton said, with the tranquil immovability of a woman who has known a man since he was a child. "Miss Grey has some knowledge of fever cases. She has made a tisane. I suggest you drink it." There was a silence in which the Duke looked at Eleanor with a quality of attention that was different from anything he had directed at her the previous evening, which was to say it was direct. He was actually looking at her, which was peculiar because almost nobody did. "Miss Grey," he said, "the companion." "Yes, Your Grace." "You needn't look at me like that." "Like what, Your Grace?" A pause. "Like a field surgeon assessing casualties." Eleanor considered this. "Would you prefer I look out the window instead?" Something crossed his face that might, in a healthier man, have been the beginning of a smile. "No," he said after a moment. "The tisane." She stayed, not because Lady Vane had sanctioned it. Lady Vane, had she been consulted, would have found the whole arrangement bewildering and possibly irregular. Not because the social proprieties encouraged it, because they did not. She stayed because the work needed doing, and she knew how to do it. And the man in the bed was genuinely ill, and no one else was stepping forward. Cassandra had been informed of the situation by her mother at luncheon. Her response, delivered in the tone of mild distaste that was her habitual register for inconvenient realities, was that she supposed it was frightfully unlucky for the Duke, and that she rather thought sick rooms were dreadful places. She said she would write him a kind note and send some hothouse fruit from the orangery. Her mother agreed this was perfectly considerate and very charming, and they had spent the afternoon in the gallery as planned. Eleanor changed the compresses every 40 minutes throughout the afternoon. She persuaded the footman assigned to the room, a young man called Peters, very earnest, very frightened, to open the windows for 20 minutes every hour, because the air in the room needed to move, and she overrode his polite alarm by the simple method of opening the nearest window herself. She kept the tisane warm at the corner of the grate and administered it every 2 hours in small measures, because men who are feverish often resist drinking in large quantities and must be managed in small ones. She read from the book she had brought, The History of Local Parish Records, which Mr. Alderton had mentioned and which proved to be in the library, not aloud, but quietly, which was company without being demanding. Dr. Granger arrived at 6:30, a compact, quick-moving man with a large bag and the cheerful briskness of country physicians who have seen too many things to be alarmed by any one of them. He examined the Duke, listened to Eleanor's account of the afternoon's progression with the attentiveness of someone who recognizes a reliable reporter, asked 2 or 3 specific questions about the tisane, and pronounced that the fever was a winter chest complaint of the worst variety, but not, he was fairly certain, the truly dangerous kind, provided it was properly tended through the night, which was the point at which such fevers were either mastered or allowed to become something graver. He prescribed rest, warmth against the chest, light food when it could be taken, and the continuation of the elderflower decoction, which he said was sound practice. He asked, plainly, whether someone would keep the night watch, because the hours between midnight and dawn were when a fever tested a man, and a fever left unwatched in those hours was a fever given permission to do its worst. Mrs. Drayton began to say that she would arrange for the watch to be kept in turns among the staff. Eleanor said that she would keep it. She said it simply, without any particular ceremony, as though it were the obvious arrangement, which to her it was. She had kept such watches before, more than she could easily count, and she knew that a fever wanted continuity of care through the dark hours, one steady pair of hands and one steady voice, not a rotation of anxious footmen handing the sick man off to one another at the turn of each hour. Dr. Granger looked at her, and looked at Mrs. Drayton, and something passed between the two of them, a physician's recognition of a competent nurse, which is a recognition that crosses every line of rank without troubling to notice them, and it was settled. He said he would return in the morning. He said, as Eleanor accompanied him to the door, that whoever had managed the afternoon had done it very sensibly, and that he would sleep easier for knowing the night was in good hands. She thanked him and went back upstairs. The house settled slowly into its night. She could hear it happening around her as she arranged the sick room for the long hours ahead. The distant sounds of the servants' supper being cleared, the guests going up to bed one wing over, doors closing, the long case clock in the hall striking the half hours in its deep, unhurried voice. Mrs. Drayton had set up a small chair by the grate, and had brought a blanket that smelled of lavender, and a fresh supply of candles, and a covered dish of broth in case the Duke could be persuaded to take it later, and had not said anything about the arrangement that might have been construed as either approval or disapproval. But she had rested her hand briefly on Eleanor's shoulder before she went, which said more than any words she might have chosen. Eleanor lowered the fire. This was the first thing. A sick-room fire wanted to be steady and moderate, not the roaring blaze that Peters, in his fright, had built up through the afternoon. A fever did not need more heat. It needed the room to be even and the air to be clean. She banked the coals down to a low red glow that would hold through the night, with occasional feeding, and she set the beeswax candles aside for the daytime and lit instead the tallow ones that had been left for the servants' watches. 4 of them, in the plain pewter holders that had stood in that room for a generation, the particular ivory yellow light that tallow throws, thicker and softer than beeswax and a little smoky, the smell of it faintly animal beneath the herbs. The light gathered close around the bed and the chair and left the far corners of the room in a comfortable dark. And this was right, too. A sick man rested better in a room that was mostly shadow, with one small pool of warm light to hold him. The Duke slept in fits. He was restless, which was the fever, and the restlessness came in waves, long stretches of shallow, effortful sleep, broken by sudden surfacings, when he would half wake and murmur something and turn his head on the pillow and sink again. She learned the rhythm of it within the first hour and set her tasks to fit it. Every 40 minutes she rose and changed the cloth on his forehead, wringing the fresh one out in the basin of cool water she kept beside the chair, laying it across his brow with the flat of her hand, pressing it gently to his skin for a moment, so that he felt the cool of it before she took her hand away. Every 2 hours she woke him enough to drink, a few careful sips of the elderflower decoction from the plain white cup, her hand behind his head, her voice low and level, telling him it was only the medicine, only a little, and that he should drink, and then he might sleep again. He drank each time without much waking, which was as she wanted it. A man too roused to sleep was a man whose fever had a longer night to work in. Between the tasks she sat. This was, in truth, the largest part of the work, and the part that no one who had not done it understood. The sitting, the being present, the holding of the long hours. The clock in the hall struck 10, and then 11, and the wind rose outside and worried at the window frames, and once she heard, very far off, the cough of a fox in the frost-white garden. She read a little by the tallow light, the history of the parish records, which was dry and comforting in its dryness, full of the names of long-dead rectors and the disputes of long-forgotten vestries. She did not read aloud. But once, sometime after 11, when the Duke's restlessness seemed to sharpen toward distress, she did begin to speak, quietly, not to say anything in particular, but only to give the room a steady human voice. And she found, without quite deciding to, that the thing she was speaking was the old evening collect her father had said every night of her childhood. Lighten our darkness, we beseech thee, and by thy great mercy defend us from all perils and dangers of this night. And the sound of it in her own mouth, in the low, tallow-lit room, was a comfort to her that she had not expected. And the Duke grew quieter as she spoke, and she wondered whether it was the words or only the voice, and concluded that it did not matter, and that it was probably the voice. She thought as she sat through those hours about her father's parish, because a sick room at night was where those memories lived. She thought about the cottages she had gone into as a girl with her father's basket over her arm, the small dark rooms with their earthen floors and their smell of wood smoke and illness, the women who had taught her without ever knowing they were teaching her, old Nurse Pooley who had shown her how to tell a fever's turn by the feel of the pulse and the look of the skin, and Widow Marsh who had kept the finest herb garden in 3 parishes and had let a solemn child of 9 help her string the drying racks. She thought about how it had felt then, to be needed and known and part of the fabric of a place, and how she had lost all of that in a single hard fortnight when the ague took her father, and how the 2 years since had been years of learning to want nothing and expect nothing and take up no more room in the world than a companion in grey wool was permitted to take. And she thought, with a clarity that came sometimes in the small hours, that there was a strange justice in finding herself here, unseen and unasked, doing the one thing she was truly good at, for a man who had not the least idea who she was. No one downstairs knew where she was tonight, or would think to wonder. No one had assigned her this. She had simply seen that a thing needed doing, and known how to do it, and done it, in the dark, without witness, exactly as she had been raised to do. And there was in that a kind of dignity that owed nothing to anyone's notice, and she held on to it, in the long, cold hours, the way one holds a warm cup with both hands. Toward 1 o'clock the fever climbed, as fevers do in the deep of the night, and the Duke grew truly restless, and for a while she gave up the chair and the book, and simply tended him, cooling cloth after cooling cloth, her hand steadying his shoulder when he turned too sharply, her voice low and even in the dark. He was half lucid in this stretch, surfacing into a confused waking that was not quite waking, and he spoke in fragments, the way the fevered do, from some country of his own that she could only guess at. Once he said, quite clearly, "Tell my father the grey mare is lame," and she said that she would, and that he was not to worry about the mare, and he subsided. Once he said, "The tenants at the Northumberland farms, the roof, it must be seen to before winter," and there was such genuine trouble in it, such a weight of care carried even into delirium, that she understood something about him that all his controlled coldness downstairs had concealed, that this was a man who lay awake, even out of his senses, worrying about the roofs over other people's heads, and that whatever else the world said of the Duke of Ashworth, It did not know him at all. And once, near the low point of the night, he opened his eyes and looked directly at her, and there was something almost frightened in it, the particular fear of the fevered who do not know where they are. And he said, "Is anyone there? I can't. There's no one." "I am here," she said, and she took his hand, which was the right thing and the human thing and had nothing improper in it, only the plain contact that a frightened, sick person needs in the dark. "There is someone here. You are not alone. You may sleep." His fingers tightened on hers for a moment, and then loosened, and his eyes closed, and he slept, and she sat holding his hand a while longer than she strictly needed to, in the small tallow-lit room, with the frost on the windows, and the clock striking 2 in the hall below, and thought that it was a strange thing to be the someone who was there, after 2 years of being no one at all. The Duke's fever broke at 3 in the morning. She knew at the moment it happened, because the quality of his sleep changed, from the tight, effortful unconsciousness of fever to something looser and more genuine, and she crossed to the bed and felt his forehead, cool, damp, the flush going out of his face, and felt a quiet satisfaction that was entirely practical and had nothing sentimental in it whatsoever, except that she felt it rather more strongly than strictly practical satisfaction would account for. She changed the damp linen at his neck for dry, and drew the coverlet up, and fed the fire a little against the coming chill of the pre-dawn, when a body that has sweated out a fever is at its most vulnerable to a fresh cold. And then she sat down again, and let herself, for the first time in the long night, feel how tired she was. He opened his eyes at 3:15, and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then at her. "Still here," he said. His voice was rough but clearer, the delirium gone out of it, a man's own voice again. "The fever's broken," she said. "You should drink some water, properly this time, and then you should sleep, and in the morning you will feel considerably worse than you do now, which is how you will know you are getting better." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "That is a grim sort of comfort." "It is the true sort," she said. "I find people prefer it on the whole, once they get used to it." He drank the water she gave him, all of it, and then he lay looking at her in the tallow light, with an expression she could not quite read, though she was practiced at reading faces, and after a moment he said, "Why?" It was a genuine question. She could hear that it was genuine because there was no accusation in it and no particular expectation, only the slightly bewildered curiosity of a man who was used to people either wanting something from him or avoiding him, and could not quite account for a third option. "Because the fever hadn't broken yet," she said, "and Peters is 19 and gets a look on his face when your temperature rises that suggests he will make extremely poor decisions under pressure." The Duke considered this. "That is a very practical reason." "I am a very practical person, Your Grace." He looked at her for a moment more, the candlelight moving on his tired face. "Miss Grey," he said. "Eleanor. Your father was a clergyman." "He was. I see." He closed his eyes. "That explains the parish medicine, and the collect at 11 o'clock. I was not so far gone that I didn't hear it." She had not known he had heard it. She found she did not mind that he had. "It explains quite a lot of things about me," she said. She meant it lightly, but it came out with more weight than she had intended, and she expected him not to notice, as people generally did not. But his eyes opened again, and he looked at her once more with that directness that was disconcerting, partly because it was so unlike the way he had looked at everyone else since her arrival. "I imagine it does," he said quietly, and then, more quietly still, on the edge of sleep, "Thank you for being the someone who was there." And she understood that he remembered that too, the low point of the night, and her hand and her voice, and she sat very still while his breathing lengthened and evened into true and restful sleep at last. She let herself out at 4 o'clock, when Peters arrived for the morning watch, and gave him his instructions: the fire moderate, the room aired, water when his Grace woke, and to fetch Mrs. Drayton and no one else if anything changed, and went to her room and slept until 9. She did not know, as she slept, that Julian, Duke of Ashworth, woke again briefly in the grey November dawn, and lay in his now quiet room, and found himself thinking, with the clarity that a broken fever leaves behind it, about a woman in a grey wool dress who had sat through the whole of the worst night of his winter, and had held his hand in the dark when he was afraid, and had not once, in all of it, asked anything of him except to drink his medicine. The next 3 days were quiet ones in the peculiar fashion of a house where the host is ill, the guests occupying themselves in an atmosphere of slightly anxious suspended ceremony. Lady Vane maintained her composure and her strategy, directing Cassandra's visible accomplishments toward whatever room or corridor seemed most likely to be relevant when the Duke was restored to health. She was not cruel in this. It was a reasonable approach to a social situation, and she believed in it entirely. But there was a relentlessness to the operation that Eleanor observed with the detached clarity of someone who has no stake in its outcome. Eleanor spent those 3 days between the sick room and the house's small library, which contained, she discovered, an unexpectedly good collection of botanical and medical texts, alongside the usual estate records and bound volumes of the Gentleman's Magazine. She kept the daytime watches now, sharing them with Mrs. Drayton, for the Duke was mending but still weak and still wanted careful feeding, beef tea, and later a coddled egg, and later still the first cautious solid food, which she introduced by degrees, because a stomach that has been through a fever is not to be trusted with too much, too soon. Doctor. Granger came each morning and declared progress, and each morning he said, with the particular candour he seemed to reserve for her, that she had turned the corner of that first night better than he could have himself, and that the Duke owed her more than he likely knew. She and Mrs. Drayton had arrived at a working relationship in those days that was not precisely friendship, but was something rather warmer than professional courtesy. An understanding between two competent women who recognized competence in each other and found it restful. They fell into the rhythm of the house together, the early stirring of the kitchen below, the maids laying the fires, the particular hush of the forenoon when the guests were occupied, and the work of the household went on quietly in the background, like the movement of a clock. Mrs. Drayton told her things, in the sick room, in the low voice one uses over a sleeping patient, about the Duke as a boy, motherless in the term times, his mother much in Bath even then, about the old Duke, who had been a hard, brilliant, disappointed man, about the way the house had grown quiet after the young Duke came into the title too soon, and had stayed quiet since, and wanted, in Mrs. Drayton's settled and unsentimental opinion, a mistress who knew what a house was for. On the 4th day, the Duke came downstairs. He was thinner than he had been, and careful in his movements, and he sat in the drawing-room by the fire with the particular quality of a man who has been reminded by his body that he is not, in fact, made of stone, and who is finding the reminder both unwelcome and somewhat impossible to ignore. He received his guests' expressions of relief with correct civility. He thanked Lady Vane for the party's forbearance. He accepted from Cassandra, with unreadable courtesy, a spray of hothouse flowers that she had arranged to have cut and brought in, and said they were very kind. Then he looked across the room to where Eleanor was sitting in her usual chair near the far window, with her book and her unremarkable grey dress, and he said, in a voice that carried to the whole room without being raised, "Miss Grey, would you come and sit here?" He meant the chair on the near side of the fireplace, which was the best chair in the room after the one he was in, and which had been quietly claimed by Lady Vane on arrival, and had been occupied by Cassandra every morning since. It was empty at this moment, as Cassandra had risen to bring the flowers, and the invitation was clear and unmistakable. Eleanor crossed the room and sat in the chair. There was a silence that lasted perhaps 5 seconds, which is, in a drawing-room, a considerable silence. Lady Vane recovered first. She said in a bright and careful voice that she was very glad to see His Grace so much recovered, and that they had all been quite worried. The Duke thanked her with even courtesy, and then turned to Eleanor and asked, with the same directness he had used in the sick room, how the botanical text was getting on, because he had been meaning to reread it himself. Eleanor told him what she had found in it. He listened. He asked questions. He knew the subject, it turned out, rather better than she did in some directions, and rather less well in others, and the conversation that followed was the most interesting she had had in 2 years, possibly longer. It ranged, unhurried, over an hour, from Parkinson's herbal into the question of what could and could not be grown in a Cambridgeshire winter, and from there, by some turning she did not afterward remember taking, into her father's parish, and the sort of doctoring a country clergyman's household had of necessity to know, and the Duke listened to all of it with an attention that did not flag, and asked, at one point, whether she had ever wished to have been a physician, and seemed genuinely to consider the barrier of her sex an irritating accident rather than a settled law of nature, which was a thing no one had ever said to her before. Cassandra Vane watched from across the room with very beautiful composure and very still hands, and said nothing. The conversation that changed things happened 2 mornings later, not in the drawing-room but in the long gallery, where Eleanor had gone before the rest of the household was down, because it was the only hour when the gallery was empty and the portrait light was good. The gallery ran the length of the west front, a long, cold, handsome room, with a row of tall windows down one side, and the family portraits down the other, generations of Ashworths looking out from their dark frames, ruffs giving way to lace, giving way to the planned stocks of the present age. And the morning light came in low and level across the bare oak floorboards, which had been polished by 200 years of feet and caught the light like still water. She was looking at a painting of the house in its early configuration. Smaller, the east wing not yet added, the formal gardens still a suggestion, when the Duke appeared at the other end of the gallery and walked toward her with the slow care of a man who is recovering and knows it. He stood beside her and looked at the painting. 1640, he said, before the Civil War. My ancestor was a royalist, which cost him the east wing and about half the silver, but he kept his head, which he always said was the better part of the bargain. He was probably right, Eleanor said. The Duke looked at her. The gallery was cold and grey-lit, their breath faintly visible in the air, and she was aware of him looking at her with the attention that had unsettled her every time he directed it her way, because it was not the attention of a man who saw a companion in grey wool. It was the attention of a man who was trying to understand something. Mrs. Drayton told me, he said, about the first afternoon, before the physician arrived, and about the night. Mrs. Drayton was managing things perfectly well herself. Mrs. Drayton says otherwise. A pause. She says you were in the still room within an hour of learning I was ill. She says you knew what to do without being told. She says you sat the whole of the night that Granger told me plainly was the night it might have gone another way, and that you never once left the room, and that you did it for a man you had known for a day and a half, and who had not so much as greeted you at his own front door. He looked at the painting again. I did not greet you, on the first evening. I want to say that I am aware of it. You had no reason to. I am a companion. One does not greet the furniture. That, he said, is exactly the sort of remark I mean to make it my business to argue you out of. He turned back to her, and she had the sense of someone choosing their words carefully, which was unusual in a man whose words generally came out as though they required no choosing. Lady Vane's dinner remark, he said. The one about reading giving companions ideas above their station. Eleanor was very still. It was nothing. Lady Vane did not intend. Lady Vane intended exactly what she said. I heard it clearly. A pause. I did not speak, which I should have. I was already unwell, but that is not an adequate excuse. A man may be unwell and still object to cruelty at his own table. I am telling you now that it was a remark that reflected its speaker and no one else, and that I have thought about it more than once since, in the night, when a man thinks about the things he ought to have said and did not. Eleanor looked at the painting of the early house, the smaller, simpler thing before the additions, and felt something loosen in her chest that she had been holding carefully closed for 2 years. Thank you, she said, because it was the true thing and the only thing. They stood in silence for a moment, looking at the small early house, and Eleanor thought that the morning light was very clear and cold, and the gallery was very quiet, and that standing beside someone in comfortable silence was a thing she had not done in a very long time, not since her father, who had been a great one for companionable silences, who had believed that two people who could be quiet together had the better part of friendship already. I wonder, the Duke said, in a different tone, careful but different, whether you would care to look at the still room properly, the one below stairs. It was my mother's project for many years, and has been rather neglected since she went to Bath. Mrs. Drayton has been managing it single-handed, and it wants attention and someone who knows what they're looking at. Eleanor looked at him. He was looking at the painting, and his face was controlled, as it always was, but there was something in the line of it that was not controlled at all. I would find that very interesting, she said. He nodded once. Good, he said. This afternoon, perhaps, if the cold doesn't worsen. The cold did not worsen. They spent an hour and a half in the still room that afternoon with Mrs. Drayton, who was visibly pleased in a way she took some care to make invisible, and who produced the household still room book, a century-old leather volume of receipts and notes in a variety of hands, the ink browning, some of the pages spotted with the ghosts of the very preparations they described. Eleanor spent most of the visit reading it with the focused attention of someone who has found a thing they genuinely want, turning the stiff pages carefully, exclaiming quietly over a receipt for a cough electuary that was almost word for word the one her father's housekeeper had used, so that for a moment the two houses seemed to touch across the years. The Duke sat on a stool near the shelves. He was still moving carefully, and she noticed he did not stand longer than he needed to, and argued with her about the efficacy of clove preparations for tooth complaints, which argument she won on the evidence, and which he conceded with the brevity that she was beginning to recognize as his particular form of grace. Those became the shape of the days that followed. The Vanes remained. Lady Vane was not a woman to abandon a field before she was certain it was lost, and the outward forms of the visit went on, the dinners and the mornings in the drawing room and the airings when the weather allowed. But underneath the forms, something had shifted, and everyone in the house could feel it, though only Lady Vane was disposed to fight it. The Duke, recovering his strength by degrees, fell into the habit of seeking Eleanor's company in the unregarded corners of the day. The early hour in the gallery, the afternoon half-hour in the library, the walk to the greenhouse in the east wing, where his mother's neglected plants stood leggy and yellowing in their pots, and where Eleanor, without being asked, began quietly to set things to rights, pinching out the dead growth, restaking what could be saved. They talked of everything and of nothing. He told her about the Northumberland farms and the roofs that wanted seeing to, which she recognized from the fevered night, and did not say so. She told him about Wymondham and the goose that had bitten her and made him laugh, which Mrs. Drayton reported afterward she had not heard the Duke do since before his father died. The truth of who had saved him surfaced publicly, not through any dramatic announcement, but through the accumulating weight of small observed facts, which is generally how important truths surface in country houses, where everyone sees everything, and the information travels faster than any deliberate communication. Peters had talked to the other footman. The other footman had talked to the maids. Mrs. Drayton had talked to Mr. Crane. Mr. Crane, who had served in this house for 22 years, and had opinions about the quality of persons who entered it, had let those opinions be known with the particular eloquence of a man who says very little, but means every word of it. By the second week, there was not a member of the household staff who did not know that Miss Grey had sat through the whole of the worst night in the sick-room, and had held his Grace's hand in the dark, and that Miss Vane had sent hothouse fruit. Lady Vane noticed. She noticed the way Eleanor was asked questions at dinner, by the clergyman, and by the baronet's wife, who had heard something from her maid, who had heard something from the Ashworth housemaid. She noticed the way the Duke's attention tracked in Eleanor's direction more consistently than it tracked anywhere else, and she concluded, with the analytical efficiency of a general reassessing terrain, that the campaign had shifted. Her response was the dinner of the second week. There were 11 at table. The Duke was still somewhat drawn but present, and the conversation had moved through the usual channels to the subject of the neighbourhood's charitable institutions. There was a school in Purton that Ashworth supported, and a subscription for a village hospital that the baronet was organising. Eleanor, who had an opinion about the administration of charitable schools derived from her experience in her father's parish, had been quietly sharing it with the baronet's wife when Lady Vane raised her voice slightly from the middle of the table. She said, with a warmth that was precisely calibrated to sound genuine, that she was sure they were all very grateful to Miss Grey for her little services during his Grace's indisposition. She said it was so useful to have a person of that sort about, someone practical-minded who did not mind the rough work of a sick-room. She said she had often thought that Eleanor's talents really lay in that direction, as a nurse or perhaps a housekeeper, that it would suit her very well, and that she should be much more comfortable in such a position than in their present arrangement. She said it sweetly and with complete conviction, and she looked for one brief moment at the Duke, because she was a clever woman, and she was making a point that was intended for him. That Eleanor Grey was useful and practical and very good in her sphere, which was below stairs, and that one's social gratitude for useful services should not be confused with something else. The table was quiet. Eleanor looked at her plate. The Duke looked at Lady Vane. His face was as controlled as it always was. She had heard people say, in the 2 years she had been listening to drawing-room talk about Ashworth, that he was unfeeling, that he was cold, that he had no warmth in him. She had had a week and more to form her own view, and her view was that he had a great deal of feeling, and kept it very tightly managed, and that this was not the same thing as coldness at all. He said, in a voice that was perfectly even, and which carried, in the silence, to every person at the table, "Lady Vane, I think you underestimate Miss Grey's position and her abilities considerably. A woman who can diagnose a fever, administer an appropriate decoction, manage a sick-room through the night the physician himself called the dangerous one, and still have time to read Parkinson's Herbal and find 3 errors in the index, is not, in my estimation, best suited to a housekeeper's role. She is suited, in my estimation, to running a considerable household with considerably more autonomy than she currently enjoys." He said it without heat. He said it as a man states a fact, something he has looked at and assessed and reached a conclusion about. And then he picked up his wine glass and took a drink, and looked at Eleanor. And she saw in his face, carefully not in his face, the thing she had been seeing for a week and had not let herself look at directly. Lady Vane said something about how she had only meant it as a compliment to Miss Grey's practical qualities. The baronet's wife said that she herself had been very grateful for practical women and had found them in short supply. Mr. Alderton, the clergyman, said that he had known Miss Grey's father, and that Thomas Grey of Wymondham had been a man of considerable learning, and that the apple did not fall far. The dinner moved on. Eleanor ate her dessert, a lemon ice, very sharp and cold, and felt somewhere underneath the composure she wore as habitually as her grey dress, something very close to joy. The Vanes departed Ashworth Park 3 days later. Lady Vane had received that morning a letter from a connection in London that required her immediate attention, or so she said, and no one disputed it, because a graceful exit, when an exit was clearly the correct move, was one of Lady Vane's genuine gifts. Cassandra said goodbye to the Duke with her usual beautiful composure, and wished him well, in a tone of voice that managed to be entirely cordial and entirely closed at the same time, which was, Eleanor thought, actually rather dignified of her. Eleanor said goodbye to Cassandra in the hall, while the luggage was being brought down, and Cassandra looked at her for a long moment and said, in a voice that was lower than her usual tone, "I hope you are well settled, Eleanor." It was the first time she had used Eleanor's given name without the prefix in 2 years, and Eleanor understood it as the complicated thing it was. Not an apology exactly, but the closest Cassandra was able to get to one, given everything she had been raised to want, and everything she had watched slip quietly out of her reach. "Thank you, Cassandra," Eleanor said. "I hope you are well settled too." Lady Vane said goodbye to her last of all, and said she hoped Eleanor would write. Eleanor said she would, and meant it, because Lady Vane was not wicked, only ambitious, and had, in her way, given Eleanor 2 years of roof and board that she might not otherwise have had, and that counted for something, even if it was not quite the something Lady Vane imagined. The carriage went down the frozen gravel drive and disappeared through the gates beneath the chestnuts. Eleanor turned back to the house. Mrs. Drayton was standing in the doorway. She said, without preamble, that His Grace wished to speak with Miss Grey in the library when she had a moment, and that she should take her time, as he was still not to rush about. Eleanor found him in the library, standing by the window with his hands clasped behind his back, in the posture that she had once thought was cold, and now recognized as simply his, the way he held himself when he was thinking, when he was not performing anything for anyone, when he was simply being Julian Ashworth in a room. He heard her come in and turned. The winter light was coming through the window behind him, the November, almost December sky very grey, the elms perfectly still outside. He said, without preliminaries, that he believed she was now without a position. She said that was correct. He said that Ashworth Park had not had a proper mistress since his mother went to Bath 3 years ago, and that the house was suffering for it, and that he was not in the habit of letting things suffer for want of proper management when the remedy was available. Eleanor looked at him. He looked at her. His face was still quite controlled, but there was, around the eyes, a quality that was not controlled at all, that was rather careful and rather earnest, and which she found, on reflection, more moving than anything more demonstrative would have been. She said she supposed that would depend on the terms of the arrangement. He said he had in mind a rather permanent arrangement, if she was willing, and that he was aware he was asking a woman who had spent 2 years being overlooked in somebody else's drawing room to take a considerable step on the basis of a fortnight's acquaintance and 1 night's fever, and that he would understand entirely if she wished to take more time. Eleanor said she had been taking time her entire life and was perhaps not in a position to afford more of it. Something crossed his face. "No," he said. "I imagine you're not." "The permanent arrangement," she said. "What exactly does it entail?" "The title," he said, "which I have always found something of a burden, and which is yours to do with as you see fit. The house, which you already know somewhat better than I do after a fortnight with the still-room book. My mother's greenhouse in the East Wing, which has been growing very old tomatoes for 3 years and wants someone who knows what they're doing, and which I notice you have already begun to rescue when you thought no one was watching. And," he said, and his voice changed slightly, the control giving way at the edges to something that was simply warm. "My company, which I am told is not always easy, but which I hope may prove bearable over time." Eleanor stood in the cold winter library, with the grey December sky beyond the window and the elms perfectly still, and thought about the rectory at Wymondham, where she had grown up, and the women in her father's parish, and 2 years of grey wool and invisible chairs, and one night watching a fever break at 3 in the morning by tallow candlelight. "Your company," she said, "I have found rather easy, on balance, even in a fever. I am considerably more tolerable when vertical," he said. "I shall take that on faith," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he crossed the room and took her hand, very carefully, as a man does who is not in the habit of the gesture and has thought about it. The same hand, she realized, that had held his in the dark at the low point of the night, though neither of them said so. And they stood in the cold library light, with the winter outside and the old house breathing around them, and it was very quiet, and it was enough. They were married in February, in the church at Purton, on a morning when the ground was still iron-hard with frost, but the light had the particular brightness of early-year sun, sharp and clean. Mr. Alderton performed the ceremony, as Eleanor had quietly requested, because he had known her father, and this seemed to her a right and proper continuity. Mrs. Drayton wept, which she did behind a perfectly composed face, with the result that only Eleanor noticed, and Eleanor pretended not to notice, which Mrs. Drayton appreciated. Half the parish came and stood at the back, and the tenants from the near farms, because word of the new duchess had gone out, and the word was good, and Mr. Crane, who had opened the door to a companion in grey wool 3 months before, opened the carriage door to a duchess afterward, with a bearing so full of quiet satisfaction that it very nearly cracked his professional composure altogether. "The Duke, Julian," he said now when they were alone, and she was trying to learn to say it, the one syllable that required more than 2 years of habit to give up, stood at the church door in the February cold, and looked at his wife with the expression she had been seeing since the library, and which she had now spent enough time with to name accurately, with sentiment. It was the expression of a man who has been lonely for a long time, and has arrived, unexpectedly, at the end of it. The year turned. Winter gave way to the uncertain warmth of March, and then to April's slower green, and the house opened itself to spring in the way old houses do. The windows unshuttered, the long gallery let in light, the kitchen garden at the back of the house turned over and planted with Eleanor's direction and Mrs. Drayton's cheerful supervision. The greenhouse in the east wing was cleared of 3 years' neglect and replanted with kitchen herbs, and behind it, in a corner that caught the afternoon sun, a kitchen garden began to take shape that was Eleanor's particular territory, rosemary and lavender in the borders, proper medicinal herbs in the beds nearest the wall, a lavender walk along the south-facing wall that she had found mapped in a very old household plan, and which had not existed in her time, but which seemed, from the slight difference in the soil, to have existed in someone else's. She took up, quietly, the work she had been raised to. The tenants came to the door with their fevers and their cut hands and their sick children, as they had once come to her father's, and were seen and helped and remembered at Christmas, and the parish learned the shape of her the way parishes do, and she was woven back into the fabric of a place at last, which was the thing she had lost and had stopped letting herself want. In the evenings, when the house was quiet, she and Julian sat in the library after dinner, which was a habit they had developed without either of them deciding to develop it, just that the library after dinner was the room that suited them both, and they were both readers, and they were both private, and they had discovered that the best thing about another person, sometimes, was that you could simply be in a room with them and think your own thoughts in companionable proximity. He read his parliamentary papers and his estate accounts. She read Parkinson, or the Stillroom book, or occasionally Miss Burney, who she maintained had been right about everything she had been right about, at dinner with the clergyman, and about whom Julian had no settled views, but was prepared to hear argument. One evening in May she was sitting at the window of the music room, which had been repaired and retuned under her direction, and which now contained a very good pianoforte that she was learning, slowly and badly, to play. The windows were open, and the smell of the lilacs below came in on the evening air, which was warm for the first time in months, genuinely warm, with the year in it, and she looked out at the drive beneath the chestnut trees, which were now in full leaf, the corridor of branches no longer bare and architectural, but green and soft, and she thought about the girl who had arrived down that drive in November, in a hired carriage, with the hat boxes and the damp wool rug, invisible in the back, dressed in grey. She was wearing blue now, not French blue, that was Cassandra's colour, and she had no desire for it, but a blue that was close to the colour of early winter sky, and which suited her rather well. This had been Julian's observation, stated as a fact with the brevity that was his characteristic form of compliment, and which she had received in the spirit in which it was intended. Julian came into the music room behind her. She heard his step on the floor. He stood for a moment in the door, and then came to stand beside her at the window, looking out at the drive and the chestnuts and the warm May evening. "The Alderton boy has been made a deacon," he said. This was a piece of local news she had already heard, but which he offered as a conversation starter, in the way he offered things now, tentatively, testing whether she wanted to talk, which was a habit he had developed, and which she found she liked more than she could quite account for. "I heard," she said, "his father is very pleased." "He would be." A pause. They looked at the chestnuts. "Are you happy here?" he said. It was not the kind of question Julian Ashworth asked. She knew that, knew it from Mrs. Drayton and from Mr. Crane, and from 2 years of other people's drawing-room talk, and from a winter and a spring of her own careful attention to this one person. He did not ask those questions because the answers mattered to him too much to be asked carelessly, and the fact that he was asking it now, in the music room with the lilacs and the May light, meant that the care had not gone out of it, only that the need to know was greater than the caution. She turned from the window and looked at him. His face was turned toward her, the evening light on it, not quite controlled in the way it now sometimes was not quite controlled when it was only the two of them, and she looked at him for a long, quiet moment and thought about the word she wanted, and found it. "Yes," she said, "I am home." She was home. "And if you have made it this far, settling in on this quiet night with us, then we are very glad you are here. We would love to hear from you in the comments. How would you rate this story, 1 to 10? And tell us, if you will, where in the world you are watching from tonight. From Scotland to Singapore, from the late-night kitchen to the quiet bedroom. Wherever you have found a small corner of peace, we are grateful for your company, as always. Rest well.